They never wore crowns or carried scepters. They didn't sit on thrones or build castles on conquered land. In America, kings wore suits. They sat in boardrooms and ruled from the top floors of banks and steel towers. Their armies were accountants and lawyers. Their weapons were railroads, oil rigs, and factories. And in 1935, they were the ones who ran the country. A 30-man council without elections, seals, or charters. Just raw, unaccountable power. These were the titans: DuPont, Ford, Mellon Morgan, Baker, Gifford Zemurray, Firestone, Rockefeller, Prince, Harriman, Odlum, James, Clement, the Guggenheims, the Whitneys, the Astors, the men behind the curtain. They wrapped themselves in the American flag and built empires that didn't need borders. They didn't conquer nations. They bought them, flipped them, rebuilt them, and sold them back at a profit. And when the European empires collapsed, it was these men, not kings or generals, who inherited the spoils. They didn't build these empires alone. They couldn't. Because in America, power isn't clean. It never was. Behind every gleaming headquarters and shining new railroad was a darker engine. Organized crime. From the waterfronts and slaughterhouses to the unions and the docks, the mafia was the muscle that kept the machine humming. Zemurray's banana empire, protected by the New Orleans mob, first Charles Matranga, then Silver Dollar, Sam Carolla, and finally Carlos Marcello. Steel and oil shipments moved because the outfit made sure they moved. Construction got done because the Genovese family signed off on it. Even Wall Street deals were greased by men whose names never appeared in the papers, but whose hands were soaked in blood. Some of these men didn't just work with the mafia. They were the mafia, only dressed in legitimacy. They knew how to launder their crimes through corporate charters and patriotic speeches. They created front companies, funded intelligence operations, and moved their money through foreign governments and shell banks before anyone knew what those terms meant. Franklin D. Roosevelt saw it for what it was. He tried to hold these titans accountable, and they hated him for it. To them, FDR was a dangerous man, a president who could flip their world upside down. And when John Kennedy came along with the same instincts, they saw a threat they couldn't ignore. Kennedy challenged their wars, their monopolies, their power over the state. He wanted to break the machine they had built since the Depression, and for that, they erased him in Dallas. Robert Kennedy tried to finish the job. By 1968, he was surging toward the White House. And again the message was sent to anyone who dares talk about equality, a fairer America, or reining in the powers behind the curtain, doesn't live to finish the sentence. 2 brothers gone, 1 shot in a motorcade, 1 in a hotel kitchen. The rest of Washington got the point. From that moment on, no president forgot who really ran the show. The titans made sure of it. Every politician that followed learned to lick the boot or be crushed by it. And once they understood they could make a president, they understood they could use one. They've installed leaders, toppled foreign governments, armed proxy armies, and used intelligence agencies like private security firms, all to protect their wealth and their reach. Donald J. Trump had the numbers, the following, and the moment. He could have used that power to drag the titans into the light, to expose their blackmail networks, their ties to foreign intelligence, their decades-long manipulation of Americans into hating one another while they looted the country. Instead, many of those same forces that once feared Roosevelt and killed the Kennedys lined up behind him. They didn't see a threat. They saw an opportunity. Even Kamala Harris admitted it. She expected Trump to be dangerous, but she never expected the titans of industry to stand with him. That's because they don't see billionaires as threats. They see them as allies, or at least as tools. They cozy up to them, buy them off, and use them as shields to protect their own power. They're terrified of going back to being nothing, to the poverty and obscurity they crawled out of. And it's not just at the top. Even the fringes of modern politics have fingerprints of the machine. Figures like Nick Fuentes, who claim to be speaking truth to power, end up pulling young people into movements that serve the same old interests. Spin a few truths, lace them with lies, and the public can't tell the difference. That confusion isn't a byproduct. It's the point. The machine has evolved. It's not just boardrooms and bank vaults anymore. It's algorithms, think tanks, shell companies, fake grassroots movements, and media empires, all working toward the same goal: control. This series is about pulling back the curtain. It's about the almighty board of directors. The unelected rulers who turned organized crime into organized capitalism, who built a system so powerful it swallowed the mafia and turned it into a department of business. From Zemurray's bananas and Rockefeller's oil to DuPont's chemicals and Baker's banks, this is the hidden history of how power in America really works, and why every attempt to challenge it, from the New Deal to Camelot, was met with bullets. This is Mafia into the Machine, the untold story of how the mob, the market, and the men who built America became one and the same. They say America is run by presidents, senators, and governors. That's a nice story for civics class. The truth is, the men who really pull the strings don't sit in Washington. They sit in boardrooms and private dining rooms, deciding the price of wheat, the cost of wages, and the value of the dollar in your pocket. 30 families, corporations, and men, not heroes, not villains, just powerful, run more of your life than the government ever will. Two of the most powerful: a banana peddler from Bessarabia named Sam Zemurray, and a dynasty of gunpowder kings from Delaware, the DuPonts. The biggest collectivist farming experiment in the world isn't in Soviet Russia. It's run by Americans across 9 countries in the Caribbean and Central America. The United Fruit Company, founded on a $20 million capitalization and now worth 10 times that, controls nearly 1 million acres in Jamaica, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Panama, and Colombia. They own 2,250 miles of railroad, a fleet of 65 steamships weighing 250,000 tons, one of the largest in the American merchant marine, plus radio stations, commissaries, hotels, hospitals, waterworks, power plants, even a snake venom lab. United Fruit employs 70,600 workers, pays $18 million a year in wages, and sells $6.5 million in American goods to its own laborers. They buy $11.5 million worth of fruit from independent growers. Their ships make 1,200 round trips a year, carrying 60,000 passengers and 1.3 million tons of cargo from Havana to Cartagena, Panama to San Francisco Company. Their operations don't just change landscapes, they change governments. More than one dictator has discovered that exile in Paris is preferable to crossing United Fruit, and the whole empire sits on the back of one humble product, the banana. 50 years ago, bananas were a curiosity, small red bunches brought north by sea captains as personal gambles. Then, in 1870, a Cape Cod captain named Lorenzo Dow Baker stopped for a drink in Port Morant, Jamaica, and bought a few bunches of yellow bananas for 25 cents each. 11 days later, in New York, he sold them for $2.50 to $3.25 a bunch. He went back for 400 bunches, and the trade was born. By 1885, Baker and partners formed the Boston Fruit Company, turning bananas from a novelty into a business. Meanwhile, a railroad builder named Minor C. Keith was laying track through the jungles of Costa Rica. To finance the work, he planted bananas along the right-of-way and shipped them north. By 1883, Keith was moving 5 million stems a year. In 1899, Keith's operation merged with Baker's. The United Fruit Company was born in New Jersey with $20 million in capital. Andrew W. Preston, a salesman turned organizer, became president. Preston expanded plantations, built inland distribution networks, and grew the Great White Fleet from 4 small ships into a global transport arm. Dividends soared from $2.50 per share in 1899 to $10 in 1900. By 1920, United Fruit declared a 100% stock dividend. Then came Sam Zemurray. Born in Bessarabia, he arrived in New York as an 11-year-old immigrant in 1888. He started with a pushcart full of fruit and a hustler's instincts. By his 20s, he was moving bananas in bulk out of Mobile and New Orleans. Zemurray learned Spanish and poker, made friends with politicians, and decided he didn't need United Fruit. He could build his own empire. In 1910, he financed a revolution in Honduras to restore ex-president Manuel Bonilla. Bonilla repaid the favor with lucrative land concessions, and Zemurray formed the Cayamel Fruit Company. He ran lean and hard, making himself rich and making trouble for United Fruit. By 1929, he had $12 to $15 million in cash and securities. United Fruit bought him out in 1930 for 300,000 shares, worth about $20 million, and Zemurray retired at 53. There was one condition. He couldn't compete. For a year, he fished and relaxed. But as the Depression hit, United Fruit's stock collapsed from 100 to 1,014 by June 1932. Zemurray's fortune was shrinking, and Zemurray didn't like losing. In June 1932, Zemurray walked into United Fruit's board meeting carrying his stock certificates and enough proxies to seize control. He demanded to be made managing director. After all, they had forbidden him from competing, but they hadn't forbidden him from taking over. Once in charge, Zemurray moved fast. He slashed $50 million from property valuations, saving $4 million a year in depreciation. He fired a quarter of the executives, toured the empire himself, and told every manager, "Use your own judgment. I don't care if you drink, just produce." He wanted banana men, not theorists. Within weeks, the stock jumped to 26. By January 1933, President Victor Cutter resigned. Zemurray installed Francis Russell Hart as chairman and became the real power at United Fruit. Nobody knows how much stock he owns today, but it's the largest block, likely more than 300,000 shares. Under Zemurray, the stock hovers in the 70s again. Today, Sam Zemurray, immigrant, street peddler, revolutionary backer, is Emperor of Bananaland and Admiral of the Great White Fleet. If Zemurray built an empire from nothing, the DuPonts built theirs over centuries. A family that turned gunpowder into a $630 million industrial giant and a single state into their private domain. It started in 1802, when Eleutheros Irénée Dupont opened a powder mill on the Brandywine Creek with Thomas Jefferson's encouragement. By the War of 1812, they were profiting $50,000. By 1934, they reported $46.7 million in peacetime net income. Today, their products, synthetic dyes, rayon, cellophane, Duco paint, Freon, tetraethyl lead, touch every American home. Their plants could switch to explosives overnight. And though they claim just 1% of earnings from munitions, every chemical they make is a building block for war. Power is concentrated in 3 great-grandsons of the founder: Pierre S. Dupont, 85, chairman of the board, shy, generous, slow, but meticulous. He built over 100 schools in Delaware and raised the state from 32nd to 10th in literacy. Irénée Dupont, 59, vice chairman, quick, talkative, fond of the sea, father of 7 daughters. Lamour Dupont, 55, president, lean, relentless, a man who sees business as exact science. He slashed payroll from 85,000 to 28,000 during Christmas 1918, despite $235 million in wartime profits, and again cut 20% of workers at the first sign of the Depression. They are fiercely united in two beliefs: loyalty to the family business and hatred of government interference. Their ancestor, Pierre Samuel Dupont, preached laissez-faire before the French Revolution. His descendants turned that belief into policy and power. There was a fourth, Alfred I Dupont, a fiery individualist and the best powder expert in the clan. In 1915, a feud split the family when Pierre excluded Alfred from a stock syndicate. Alfred, who had once saved the company from sale, forced them into a $12 million buyout and watched the business like a hawk until his death in 1935. Despite the infighting, the Duponts built a powder trust, buying more than 100 companies until Theodore Roosevelt broke them up. World War I brought new opportunities. The US seized German dye patents, a blow to Germany worse than losing battles, and DuPont turned them into profit. They moved beyond munitions into chemicals, rayon, cellophane, lacquers, and more. They built over 100 plants, bought Remington Arms in 1933, and acquired the Peters Cartridge Company and Charles Parker's Shotgun Division. In 1934 alone, they spent $27 million on expansion, including bankrupt plants and pigment factories. Their smartest move came on the advice of a quiet man named John J. Raskob. DuPont borrowed $50 million from J.P. Morgan and invested $80 million in General Motors, buying a 25% stake. Pierre became GM's president, Raskob his lieutenant. That $80 million investment has since paid $250 million in dividends. Today, 44% of DuPont income comes from GM, 46% from chemicals, and 10% from other ventures. They paid $7.5 million in GM dividends in the first half of 1935 alone. There are 11,065,000 shares of DuPont common stock and 1,092,048 debenture shares outstanding. The Christiana Securities Company, the family trust, controls 3,040,000 shares, 27.56% of the total, and runs Delaware like a private duchy. They own newspapers, utilities, banks, the state Republican Party, even the governor. In Delaware, they say, you can't start a business unless a DuPont's in it. It's not entirely a joke. The DuPont estates line the Brandywine like castles. They built highways, schools, hospitals, playgrounds, even cared for the state's elderly on their own dime. If they're despots, they're benevolent despots. Delaware is richer, more literate, more developed than it would have been without them. Perhaps because, deep down, the DuPonts believe the state belongs to them. They built their empire with patience, precision, and power, the same qualities that define Sam Zemurray's Banana Republic. Together, these men show how power in America really works. Presidents come and go. Empires like United Fruit and DuPont endure. They call it the biggest company on earth, bigger than Ford, bigger than Standard Oil, and most people would still miss the name. No flash, no stunts, no bets it can't hedge. Yet it quietly regulates the value of mortgages in the United States and touches every deed in the country. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, seated under the shadow of a Venetian clock tower at Madison Square. The man who keeps the wheels greased is Frederick Ecker. He walked 62 years ago, 15 years old, a raw kid with a mailroom badge and $4 a week. He sits now as president on $180,000 a year, custodian of close to $4 billion in assets, and protector of roughly 43 million policies. In 1933 alone, every working day, Metropolitan paid out $1,800,000 to make good on the policies of the people who had to die to prove the system works. It pushed nearly $900,000 more a day into investments, and it wrote or revived about 20,000 policies every 24 hours, over $10,500,000 in face value each day. Depressions don't scare life insurance. When men lose faith in politicians, cities, or the darlings of Wall Street, they still trust a company that never misses a claim. Metropolitan is mutual. The policyholders own it and vote the directors. On paper, every policyholder has a voice. In practice, a little over 400,000 vote each year, and there's never been an opposition ticket. The slate renews itself. The mission doesn't change: keep insurance cheap, steady, and paid. When Ecker arrived, Metropolitan held $2 million in assets and 361,048 policies totaling $86,432,107. Under his hand, the figures went off the chart. Roughly 43 million policies, adding up to about $20 billion, and assets climbing toward $4 billion across the US and Canada. He started with the old creed. Life insurance means a check for the family when the breadwinner dies, at least enough to bury him. But he learned fast. Industrial, group, personal, and accident policies had room to run. After Charles E. Hughes' forced reform in 1903, Ecker read the new air as an opening. Metropolitan already had a reputation for fairness. The law capped straight life, not industrial. The company leaned in. Industrial took the major share. Group and personal followed. Straight life kept pace. Ecker became treasurer, grabbed the throttle, and never let go. Years before the title president came his way. He understood confidence. A young mutual had to be popular and predictable. He studied the British experiments: old age, unemployment, personal accident. Old age and accident made sense. Unemployment bothered him. He went to Europe, came back more skeptical. He didn't want government to handle it. In his book, unemployment had to be funded by the employed while they were employed. Insurance was thrift. You saved for yourself. That's how you protect the bonds, stocks, and mortgages that back the checks you promised to write. Ecker's style is iron wrapped in courtesy. A Civil War major for a father and an Alsatian grandfather on a Napoleonic staff put a little drill in the blood. He runs 50,000 employees like an army corps. Work, rest, eat, always with morale and efficiency in mind, always for Metropolitan's benefit. He doesn't own the place. As a policyholder, he gets one vote like anyone else. His authority has earned decades of clean administration. He did push his son, Frederick W., up to treasurer, but the kid could do the job. He's no raider. He's publicly condemned insiders speculating in the securities of companies they're reorganizing. Still, the crosscurrents are ugly. An independent committee of bondholders at the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul blasted him, urging the ICC to reject him as a voting trustee. Their bill of particulars: Ecker wears too many badges: life insurer, savings bank vice president, commercial bank director, investment trust director, railroad director, public utility director. They say the interlocks run from him to trustees tied to bankers like J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb and Company, and Dillon Reed and Company, that he chaired protective committees that approved heavy fees in earlier St. Paul reorganizations, that no man in his position can be truly independent. Strip it down. This is what happens when directorates interlock. Ecker's trying to defend railroad equities for the sake of the insurance portfolios he must protect, and at the same time he's effectively pledging insurance reserves to prop up bankrupt lines. It's an impossible angle, but it's also the era's standard angle. He was an optimist through Coolidge and Hoover. St. Paul's trouble started in 1925. In 1928, he still voted to buy $10 million of Rock Island stock. In 1930, He okayed a stake in Gulf, Mobile and Northern to feed a railroad expansion program. He kept calling the turn for better days. What he can't square is that the 1929 world doesn't come back without the same easy medicine that inflated it. He opposes government insurance. It says it rots morale and paternalizes the country. He's too honest to deny that Metropolitan's bulk, industrial insurance, averages about $350 a person. Call it what it is, burial insurance. Yet even there he's lenient on mortgage foreclosures because the policyholders come first. Insurance companies weren't colder than anyone else before the smash. They weren't wiser either. They rode the credit wave like the rest. Actuarial tables, stone facts, carried them through when the market didn't. On average, they don't miss. Which is why ordinary Americans keep picking life insurance, Ecker's kind, as the safest box to stash their future, whether the bet is on a policy, a mortgage, or both. Most people would never have heard the name Weyerhaeuser if a 9-year-old boy hadn't been grabbed and ransomed for $200,000, and if federal men hadn't chased the kidnappers down. The family preferred to keep the light off their name. Hard to stay dark when you're the country's biggest lumber barons. 35 years ago, people said the Weyerhaeusers and their partners controlled 400 million acres, 62,500 square miles. Exaggerated, almost certainly. But today they still hold at least 2 million acres of prime Douglas fir, cedar, white pine and birch in Idaho, Oregon and Washington. In that wet belt between the Cascades and the coast, a Douglas fir can reach maturity in decades, not centuries. The crop replenishes if you treat it right. They didn't at first. Like every big-time logger, they cut hard in Wisconsin and Minnesota, tore through stands, ignored saplings, watched fires eat millions. When Minnesota thinned, they headed west, Idaho, then the inland empire between Rockies and Cascades. Out there, one thing slowed the waste. Gifford Pinchot preached conservation to Theodore Roosevelt, and Washington leaned on the industry. The Crusaders overreached sometimes, but without them, the country's erosion problem, bad enough already, might have been ruinous. Conservation actually helped them. The New Deal Lumber Code let companies build the cost of conservation into wholesale prices. Meanwhile, the market turned mean. The Depression froze building. Cement and steel muscled into house frames. New insulating materials took bites out of wood. The Weyerhaeusers adjusted. They standardized cuts, boards, sills, frames all on even measures. They made their own insulation. They sold standardized houses. They opened markets in China, Japan, South Africa, and Latin America. They tuned up logistics so you could ship Pacific Coast lumber through the canal and drag it by rail into the Midwest at prices that could beat Southern wood. Smart moves kept the empire upright while other firms went over. Lately, they've lost around $1 million a year on estimates. They can eat it, so long as the markets hold, and the old reserves, salted away in fat years, cover the red. The story starts with Frederick Weyerhaeuser, born 1834, in Niedersolheim, near Worms, who emigrated at 20. He landed in Erie, Pennsylvania, maybe because Sarah Elizabeth Bloedel, his childhood sweetheart, had gone there first. He wanted a farm. He got $4 a week in a brewery. When Sarah had to help a sister in Rock Island, Illinois, Dutch Fred followed. He worked railroad construction for the Rock Island and Peoria until the job dried up. Then a sawmill, Meade, March and Smith, put him on. He rose to foreman. He married Sarah in 1857. The Panic of '57 was his opening. Money vanished. He traded lumber for livestock and produce, built houses and barns, traded back with rivermen for logs to feed crude machines. By 1860, he'd saved $8,000. With his brother-in-law, F.C.A. Denkman, he took control of the Rock Island mill he once ran. He organized loggers up the Chippewa into a co-op, so the drive didn't degenerate into brawls over floating logs. He and his circle cut Wisconsin to ribbons and moved to virgin Minnesota. People say that what Weyerhaeuser, T.H. Shevlin, T.B. Walker and the rest cleared made room for wheat, the base for the flour trade that built Minneapolis and St. Paul. The forests became fields. Whether it happened too fast is still an argument. In St. Paul, Weyerhaeuser bought a house next door to James J. Hill, the rail titan worried about the Northern Pacific's alternate land grants. Hill took him into the Inland Empire. Weyerhaeuser saw the timber, shook his head at the waist, and cut a deal. 900,000 acres at $6 an acre. He kept buying, always pulling in working partners who'd play ball, never wasting time on rivalry. He built to about 2 million acres, the last great virgin stands. He wasn't a monopolist by posture. He preferred combinations to fights, always took minority positions, and controlled by competence and trust. He was fair to labor by the standards of his time. On his 50th anniversary, he and Sarah rowed a refitted stern-wheeler, the cranky old raft tug Frederick Weyerhaeuser, back to Rock Island in a victory lap. When he bought those western forests, he said it plain, not for ourselves and our children, but for our grandchildren. He died in 1914 at 80. People guessed his worth from $250 million up to $1 billion. $200 million is the sober number. Biggest lumberman in the world. All 4 sons came into the business. John Philip and Charles A. are gone. Rudolph M. succeeded him in the railroad seats, Northern Pacific, and in Idaho timber power. Frederick E. became president of Potlatch Forests, took the Great Northern Directorship, and, with Rudolph, holds a guiding hand in the Weyerhaeuser corporations. Forests, mills, a steamship line, 4 railroads, manufacturing plants, and a stack of subsidiaries. The brothers dominate the First National Bank of St. Paul, the Weyerhaeuser Bank. They're opposites in manner, Rudolph brisk and gruff, Frederick calm and conciliatory, but they've never quarreled. The 3rd generation is in the harness. John Philip Jr., father of the kidnapped boy, is vice president of Weyerhaeuser Timber Company in Tacoma. Frederick King, Frederick E.'s son, runs General Timber Service Company of St. Paul, the consolidating arm for the whole group, the de facto family holding company. Most top executives are old allies of the founder or their sons. In this outfit, loyalty sticks. What are they worth today? Hard to say. Lumbermen claim that even at a maximum annual cut of 1,800,000,000 feet, 18% of the nation's capacity, the family can't burn through reserves as fast as the trees grow back. The family stake sits at about 20% across the enterprise map, and they still control it. Once they cut like everyone else, too hard, too fast. Then markets changed, Washington leaned in, and the family pivoted, conservation priced in, products standardized, routes optimized, new buyers found. The empire bent, but didn't break. Like Ecker's world of actuarial certainties and steady checks, the Weyerhaeuser machine runs on patience, cash discipline, and the same quiet rule that keeps the lights on in every house they helped build. Adjust, conserve, endure. They sell meat to a nation and keep doing it when business is good, bad, or sideways. Swift and Company sits at the center of the Chicago Packers. Armour, Wilson, Cudahy, Morris. One web stretching coast to coast. It's the one that stayed closest to the family, slipped past the bankers in the lean years, and kept its hand on the tiller after the World War, while others took on water. 50 years of work since Gustavus Franklin Swift put his name over the door, built an operation so large, its lifetime gross hovers near $20 billion. In the fat stretch from 1918 to 1920, sales ran $1,200,000,000, $1,100,000,000, and $1,200,000,000. In 1921, with the country bleeding red, Swift still showed $800 million in gross. A year later, it sold $650 million and earned $13,049,217, about 8.79% on the stock. The boast is simple. Swift never missed a dividend. If current earnings were shy, surplus made up the gap. In 1930, while prices fell, Swift cut notes and accounts roughly in half, lifted cash, earned $12,491,188, paid the usual half-year dividends, and still left surplus at $77,707,888. By the end of last year, the company was still standing tall. Capital investment, about $310 million. A 5% 10-year gold issue due 1944, trimmed by more than $13 million. A 5% Chicago gold note due 1940, cut by $1,500,000. Reductions taken out of money that could have been left to swell earnings. Current assets included U.S. governments and other marketable securities carried at cost, well above market. But the bet on the paper was deliberate. Pessimism or not, Swift looked set to push $750 million in sales this year. The headaches are real. Drought hammered livestock. Processing taxes lifted meat prices past what the public wants to pay. The packers, Swift included, wear the blame at the butcher's block and try timidly to explain the arithmetic. They also carry a name they earned in another era, the stockyards that Upton Sinclair turned into a national nightmare. The yards today are cleaned up, plants modernized, producer prices kept up when jealousy between houses would have dragged them down, wholesale kept as low as possible to hold market share. And for all the talk about fish, nobody in America has ever marketed fish with the efficiency and scale the packers bring to meat, poultry, and even vegetables. The business turned on two pieces of leverage. Philip Armour perfected the conveyor line that saved every profitable byproduct. Gustavus Swift had the cooler idea, the refrigerator car. In the late 70s, the transcontinentals wouldn't touch it. They feared losing the tonnage of live cattle rolling east to be slaughtered. Swift convinced the Grand Trunk to haul 10 cars if he built them. By 1880, the roads saw it. Dressed beef weighed about 40% less than live, but there was more of it moving and more profit. Eastern slaughterhouses fought. It meant concentration in Chicago, Kansas City, Omaha, and cheaper steak on an eastern table. It also meant no more bone-thin steers crawling into town after 2,000 miles on the hoof. Swift started small. A Cape Cod boy from Sagamore with $20 from his father, he bought a heifer for $19, sold the meat off a cart, and cleared $10. He kept that logic for life. Every ounce of the carcass must pay: meat, fat, hide, glue. He was a hard individualist with a genuine social conscience, charitable in a way that, measured by fortune, put him well ahead of many philanthropists by the time he died in 1903. The family did not chase spectacle. They built out the business. Control stayed in the blood. Lewis F. Swift entered as a director when incorporation came in 1885, served as treasurer to 1895, president from 1895 to 1931. 28 crucial years of antitrust fights, Roosevelt's trust-busting, federal suits to pry apart associated interests, and, finally, a Supreme Court settlement that let poultry, butter and eggs, cheese, glues, and cleansers remain as subsidiaries. War and boom followed. Today, G.F. Swift is inactive. Charles H. Swift chairs the board. Harold H. Swift is president. Alden B. Swift and George H. Swift sit as directors. George holding the New England brief, a nod to the old Boston start. There are 9 directors in all. The family still sets the pace. How much stock do they own? Less than legend. In the great American way, bankers often sit quietly behind the curtain. The Armours are the textbook case, H. Prince of Boston and Coon, Loeb as the whip hands. though Swift is less a banker's puppet and more a family machine running with outside capital. The company's own figures tell the shape of ownership. About 53,000 individual stockholders in May 1935, nearly half women, 13,000 with 10 shares or less, 9,700 with 11 to 20, 13,400 with 21 to 50, 8,600 with 51 to 100, 8,000 with 101 to 500. The family's edge is reputation, buying savvy, and the daily discipline of a trade they learned on the killing floor. Market share hovers near 15% of national packing. The line runs to roughly 55 products. Employment is up about 20%, the best year since 1920. The company's labor record is solid, wages and conditions better than the old days, and increased mechanization hasn't cut heads the way outsiders predict. Employees are pushed to buy stock. The Swifts are quiet men with Cape Cod roots, Yankee shrewdness, and the ability to price a steer better than most buyers in the yards. They vote mostly Republican and then publish, in their 50th yearbook, a clean shot at high tariffs. Prosperity follows trade, not restriction. Let Americans specialize in what our resources make cheapest and trade for the rest. Output per worker rises, and so does the standard of living. They even concede, out loud, that the United States buys Argentine beef and Britain eats it, frozen or chilled, as part of that bargain. And one stray scrap of American life won't die. Preston, Kansas, November 16th. J.R. Crimble turns 100 and gives his method: rise at daybreak, retire early, eat cold meals, and drink beer. The country runs on theories. The stockyards run on facts. The biggest bank in America, arguably the most powerful in the world, sits behind a plain name, the Chase National Bank. Resources, $1,880 million. Connections that reach everywhere. A Rockefeller Bank, in the street's shorthand. The man in the chair is Winthrop W. Aldrich. Titles mislead. He used to be president. He moved up to chairman to get out of the daily grind and shape policy. Gold spoon, that's his origin story. His father, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, ran the tariff, fought banking reform, and set old guard policy when Harding and Coolidge were still playing ward games back home. Aldrich's sister, Abby, married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. in 1901. Winthrop read law at Harvard, 1910. Married Mary Alexander in 1916, and lived like a careful, well-bred New Yorker. Office by day, family at night. Yacht when the wind was right. In the war, he made lieutenant in the Naval Reserve, navigating the cruiser New Orleans. Afterward, he skipped back to law, then took the number 2 chair at Murray, Aldrich, and Webb. He was unknown in the papers, respecting where it counted. On the water he made a name, won the Astor Cup in 1923 with the schooner Flying Cloud, became a 2-time Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, and navigated Enterprise against Lipton's Shamrock 5 for the America's Cup. While Aldrich built a reputation, Gates McGarrah and John McHugh stitched together the mergers that became Chase, mechanics and metals as the base, then a string of additions and branches. They stepped back. Albert H. Wiggin, in from National Park, took the wheel. He was a banker's banker, sharp in expansion, reckless in speculation, and he drove Chase on the rising tide that broke in 1929. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. didn't like Wiggin's taste for the market. In 1929, he handed Aldrich a test. Take on Colonel Robert W. Stewart at Standard Oil of Indiana over the 6-year suppression of Continental Trading Corporation profits. Stewart had friends and the Rockefeller bogeyman to wave around. Aldrich still pulled it off. That win told the Rockefellers he was more than a club commodore. In December 1929, Chellis A. Austin's exit at Equitable Trust opened a door. Aldrich, protesting, "I'm a lawyer, not a banker," took the presidency. Within months, Equitable merged into Chase. Charles S. McCain, handsome, young, speculative in outlook, rotated into the chair. Wiggin moved to chair the executive committee, and Aldrich became president. The title mattered less than the backing. The Rockefellers had picked their man. Aldrich got the books, and by January 1931 saw what Wiggin had done. $184 million pumped into speculative accounts in 3 years, and the positions were sour. Aldrich, with Rockefeller weight, forced the issue. He made Chase call a loan of more than $70 million run through Pynchon and Company on General Theatre's equipment syndicates. Pynchon collapsed. As of July 1, 1931, on Aldrich's insistence, Chase, the biggest commercial bank in the world under Wiggin, was out of the speculative market. In May 1932, he moved to vice chairman of the governing board to keep a closer eye on the house where Wiggin still sat as chairman. On January 10, 1933, Wiggin was out with a $100,000 a year pension for salve. Aldrich took the chair. McCain bounced back into the presidency. Aldrich learned fast. On February 22, 1933, he told the Senate Finance Committee he had unshaken faith in the banks and praised the RFC. 4 days later, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday. On March 8th, Aldrich called for a total divorce of securities affiliates from every bank, private and otherwise. Wall Street froze. William C. Potter at Guaranty Trust called the idea destructive. The Rockefellers were accused of knifing Morgan and Kuhn. Loeb, with reform, dressed as righteousness. Aldrich didn't blink. In April, he proposed shutting down Chase Harris, Forbes, the bank's securities arm. Congress passed the law. Weeks ago, partners at J.P. Morgan, including the founder's younger son, resigned to start a separate securities house. Then came the blowback. In October, Wiggin sat before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee and swore that Chase Securities and its Metropolitan Corporation subsidiary had churned $860 million through pools in 5 years for a loss of $48 million, and that he himself, through 3 family corporations, had cleared $10,425,667 in open market trades in Chase stock. Aldrich shot a denial. He didn't know, didn't approve, wouldn't allow it on his watch. It didn't help with the public. Cuban entanglement stoked the anger, and withdrawals followed. The bank still closed the year with bigger resources, thanks to Rockefeller money and the simple fact that nobody sane picks a fight with the biggest bank in the country. The street took it personal. Aldrich told a friend he'd never go back to a certain uptown clubmen he'd sponsored, cut him dead in the lounge. That's the man, shy, allergic to the spotlight, thin-skinned with critics, generous with time and money, but tone-deaf to crowds. He hates work relief, says it costs triple home relief, and misses the psychology of giving a man a shovel instead of a check. He resigned, curtly, from Secretary Roper's Business Advisory Council to register his disgust with policy drift. Call him unimaginative if you like, mentally stiff, but morally straight and stubbornly loyal to the habits he was raised on. Those habits do not include rigging markets. How much does Chase reflect Aldrich? Not much. He's no showman, no oracle, and even the Rockefellers don't own the machine. Chase is the apparatus of capital itself, bigger than a name on a door. 22 directors send their influence into every sector. Several will surface again in this story. The least of them is a giant by the measure that counts. The number of pay envelopes and dinner tables balanced on decisions made in rooms the public never sees. When Aldrich rises from the chair, someone else will sit. The machine keeps time. That's how America runs, until it runs another way. He was a poor kid from Warrensburg, Missouri, the grocer's son who liked machines and noise. In Los Angeles, he finished high school, bought a wrecked Ford at 17 for $75, rebuilt it, and sold it to a movie colonist for $675. The next year he turned 20 cars, averaging $500 profit each. A garage followed, then anything that moved. Race mechanic, driver, stage lines, truck lines, used car lots, new car rentals, 5 years as a Chicago distributor. He bet big on a Death Valley trucking line and lost it all. By 1921 he was in Chicago with $45 and a draw of $35 a week selling moon cars. A year later, he was sales manager, the best moon pusher anyone had seen. Soon he held Illinois and Wisconsin, then a partnership and a fresh stake of $100,000. He wanted real money. Ralph Austin Baird at Auburn was drowning. Cord took the general manager's job on one condition, just the right to buy control if he turned it around and got the bankers out whole. That was 1923. Auburn built 175 cars that year. Cord scrapped the stock, sold the junk for what he could get, and leaned on Lycoming for a straight 8. In 1924, he sold 2,000 Auburns and cleared $200,000. In 1926, $1,700,000. In 1927, a $4 cash dividend plus 8% in stock. In 1929, on the edge of collapse, he brought out a front drive. Even in 1931, he showed $3 million profit. He wasn't just Auburn. By the end of 1931, he had Duesenberg, building 85% of U.S. cars priced over $8,500, Lycoming Motors, his engines, Stinson Aircraft, 2/3 of Tremotors and 3/4 of cabin planes, Spencer Heating, Central Manufacturing, Limousine Body, everything from boilers to bodies. He launched Century Pacific Airlines, 14,000 route miles a day, about 1/3 of the nation's passengers. He bid 30 cents a pound for airmail when the going rate was 85 cents, and still couldn't pry a contract out of Washington. Pilots said he shaved safety margins and underpaid crews. Dangerous, they called him. He called it business. Then came the play he liked best: fast, public, violent. In 1932, the Aviation Corporation of Delaware was a sprawl of airlines and factories run by 35 directors and too many egos. W. Averill Harriman was edging out. Frank A. Vanderlip admired Cord's nerve. Cord sold his Century Pacific to aviation for stock, then quietly bought aviation shares anywhere he could find them. By the fall, he had about 850,000, one of the biggest blocks, plus commitments from heavy friends. The fight for control ran all summer into late fall, old Wall Street style. On December 1st, 1932, no one was quite sure how, but Cord sat the saddle. The board was cut from 35 to 16, 8 from each camp. One of the old 8 soon quit, 8 to 7 for Cord. The next day, Cord bought 45,000 shares of Transamerica Airline from Richard F. Hoyt, AGWI Lines, Curtis Wright, and 40 more. He already had 45,000, 90,000 shares, about 95%, and he flipped Transamerica to aviation at cost. By March 18, 1933, he held 1,100,000 shares of aviation, more than 1/3 of the $20 million company. Chairman of the board, clean. But the heat came with it. William Green of the AFL said Cord fought organized labor everywhere he touched. Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia warned the Postmaster General that Cord would drive down standards for pilots and mechanics. 15 pilots backed LaGuardia. In March 1934, as the airmail was rebid, E. H. Hamilton of the Airmail Association charged that the new setup favored bids tied to Cord and would play havoc with pilots. His flashiest grab was New York shipbuilding at Camden. In the summer of 1933, he heard, somehow, that 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, $38 million plus, were headed there under the Navy program. The Yard was in trouble, but those contracts promised fat if you ran them right. New York Ship also held U.S. rights to build German diesel traction engines. The founders' voting stock was parked at Chase National and Blair & Company, collateral for busted Pynchon and Company loans. Cord bought that stock for $2 million, and with it, a $15 million company, and the Navy work. He also picked up Checker Cab of Kalamazoo for $4,500,000, insurance for future expansions in transport. Then the trouble. Cord didn't know how to handle labor, and shipyard labor on federal work won't eat what it thinks is injustice. There was a strike in 1934, another 16 weeks last summer, costing the company $1 million by its own count, and ending only when Washington and local pressure pinned it down. For the 6 months, ended June 30th, the Yard showed a net deficit of $418,561, and the 7% preferred ran $20.93 a share in arrears. Worse, New York Ship had to take over a Merry Export line, 25 good steamers with a monopoly on American trade to the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Cord couldn't make them pay. In May, the company told the exchange it sold the lot, about 250,000 tons, to a Lehman Brothers T. L. Chadbourne Syndicate for $885,495, just to clear construction costs, carrying charges and interest. A swell bargain in ships. Rumors bred subpoenas. A Senate committee wanted him. In March 1934, after a Hollywood report that kidnappers had threatened his children, he denied it. Cord and family vanished. 2 months later, he turned up in England. The yacht, Virginia, sailed from New York, lifted them at Southampton, and went to foreign ports. Vanderlip confirmed it. Cord would be away for an indefinite time. Since then, he's been out of the lights. L.B. Manthe, his lieutenant, runs the Cord Corporation and New York Ship. Other lieutenants steer the lesser pieces. Maybe Cord is tired. Maybe he's scared. Maybe he's waiting. If he comes back, he'll make it noisy. He's made mistakes. Labor first. He's tried to do too much at once. But the small, wiry Scot with the fast hands and the steel-rimmed glasses made more friends than enemies. Ask him what he wants, and he blinks like you missed the point. Beans in the belly, a roof overhead, kids taken care of. Make money, have some fun. If you pass through Grand Central between 9 and 9:30, you might brush past a grey-suited man in his 60s with a square jaw and clear blue eyes, and never know you just crossed the guy who budgets your kitchen. John A. Hartford runs the biggest food outfit on earth. His company owns nearly 16,000 stores. Last year it did $819,616,727, more than Ford, Sears, Montgomery Ward, and J.C. Penney combined. It employs 90,000 people. After the Fords, no American family holds a major corporation tighter. A&P is essentially one family, John and his older brother, George L., 2 trustees holding, for about 30 relatives, 1,150,000 voting common shares and 578,000 non-voting, 83% of all common, and 55% of the preferred via $5 million of convertible notes. At market, their holdings clear $273 million. In 1934, total income was $30,139,666. Net, $20,473,190. Dividends, $16,430,796. Surplus gained $4,047,394 on top of a $94,384,040 carryover. Preferred earned $78.65 a share. Common, $8.94. Current assets stood at $165,347,833. Total assets at $193,799,126. Capital at $133,273,993. Since the war, they've averaged about $1 billion a year in gross and poured $20 million in annual dividends into the family. The brothers grew up in Orange, New Jersey, sons of George Huntington Hartford, honest, narrow, a Barnum for tea and coffee. The old man came down from Augusta, Maine, and in 1859 opened the Great American Tea Company on Vesey Street. Vermilion front, gold leaf trim, a Chinese pagoda for a cashier's desk, a huge gilt T above the door, a band on Saturday nights. He added stores, then wagons that sold tea door to door. He didn't believe in college. The boys went to work. George, at 12, took Saturday cash in Newark. At 16, he moved to the Vesey Street Pagoda. There were 100 stores around 1880, coffee and tea, to Chicago. 8 years later, John joined him. George added baking soda. When manufacturers asked too much, he set a chemist behind a screen and made it himself. A&P's first private brand. By 1900, there were 200 stores. By 1912, 400. Slow by modern standards. In 1912, John made the move that built the empire, the economy grocery. Standard goods, no credit, no deliveries, no phone orders. He planted the first one on an obscure Newark side street next to a strong A&P. In 30 days, the new store killed the old. In 3 years, A&P opened 3,000 more. The rules were simple. Mass purchasing and a tiny margin on a massive turnover. Each store carried the same budget: $1,000 equipment, $1,000 stock, and $1,000 working cash. If it didn't pay fast, they shut it and moved the staff to a spot that did. John is the field general, 6 months a year on the road, drifting into stores, talking to managers and clerks, making A&P feel local. George is finance, hasn't toured a store in years. He watches cash and contracts. In 1927, he smelled collapse and shortened leases to 1 year with renewals. In 1931, he refused cigarette contracts unless manufacturers held prices until A&P's inventory cleared. Those 2 calls helped them slip the depression that crippled rivals. In 1933, when margin reached 2.49%, John wanted to cut prices. George wanted the buffer higher in case commodities skidded again. Labor. The stores are stable. A&P's rule: install labor-saving gear, but don't lay a man off until you've found him another job. Store managers get bonuses for beating sales quotas. All but 1 of 7 division heads rose from clerks. Employees hold 128,000 shares. The no-credit rule gets bent when it builds the trade. Inspectors know it, and managers eat the risk themselves. Last October, a strike in Cleveland blew up. Mr. John threatened to close 300 stores, 2,200 jobs. But at the showdown he compromised. No closed shop, yes to the right to join any union. Labor called it reluctant. Government pressure helped. In 1933, he swore A&P would never fight a chain store tax. He'd rather fold than pay. On June 12th this year, A&P sued in federal court in Iowa to block the new state chain store tax as discriminatory and confiscatory, citing $181,000 in 1934 profit versus a $440,440 tax bill under the law. The profits are in the method: mass buying, small margins, relentless turnover. The result: grocery prices bent down across the country. The Hartford's live plane. George sticks to the numbers. John rides horses at Valhalla and crosses to Europe now and then. They stay out of other people's businesses. though John sits for A&P's sake on Guarantee Trust and Girard Trust boards. Both are childless, but the bench is ready. Nephews and grandnephews hold office. Arthur H. Hoffman, Vice President, George D. Clues, Treasurer, William G. Wrightson, Vice President. Control isn't going anywhere. They call each other Mr. John and Mr. George, two faces that look the same until you stand close. One builds the stores and talks to the clerks. The other watches the till and bets the weather. Together they taught a continent how to shop. He's the tire you don't notice until a nail finds it. On a low-priced car with standard equipment, odds are 3 in 5 you're riding Firestone. That's Harvey S. Firestone, chairman in Akron, master of 32 subsidiaries, and through rubber closer to running Liberia than Mussolini ever was to Ethiopia. Rubber is a knife fight, Goodrich, Goodyear, US. Rubber all swinging, but Firestone's the purest one-man build in the ring. Control sits in the family. Of 1,897,597 common shares, par $10. The company itself holds 356,783. Firestone personally 260,000, Harvey Jr. 24,920, Russell A. 29,512, and the sons own 1/6 each of Harble Corporation, a family trust with another 260,000 shares. The preferred, 465,975 shares at 6%, has never missed a dividend. 134,025, 22%, retired since 1929, and they keep whittling it as profits allow. Common cites around 14.5 and pays 40 cents. Current assets, about $133,890,772. Net working capital, $47,784,836. First half to April. 30. $2,155,034 income, $4.62 on the preferred, against $1,521,745 a year earlier. 1934 sales were pegged near $99,130,000, up 31%. This year, Ford gives him roughly 60% of 1 million car tire orders, with big slices from GM and others. Sidelines grow. Steel and rubber accessories, wheel rims, overshoes, beverage containers, vibration dampers. No bonded debt at the parent. $17,350,000 in subsidiary bonds guaranteed. A footnote that matters less if Liberia hits. He helped smash Britain's post-war Stevenson restriction scheme. The corner that yanked rubber from 15 cents, 1922, to $1.23, 1925, and still fell short of the old Brazilian gouge. Firestone's answer, find dirt he could control. The Philippines wanted little farmers. Mexico gave him 35,000 acres in Tabasco for experiments. Liberia offered the whole hand. Cheap labor, right climate, Washington's wink, and a conscience salve for State Department headaches with British and French colonies. He leased 1 million acres for 99 years, promised to modernize Monrovia and build roads, hospitals, schools, sewers, warehouses, and breakwaters. Boom came, prices normalized, and the chatter said he'd pocket the concession and walk. He didn't. Last spring, Harvey Jr. came back with the scorecard. 50,000 acres cleared, 10 million selected trees planted, 6,000 acres ready to tap this year at roughly £500 latex per acre, about 1,500 short tons, with an ultimate target of 200,000 tons a year, close to half the world's present output. The strategic rub. We dumped the Philippines to dodge politics. Liberia could drag us deeper, and nobody at home will organize a revolt against cheap African rubber. He's no warmonger. He's the last type of American pioneer, the factory version. Friends were John Burroughs, Thomas A. Edison, and Henry Ford. Better start than the other three, an Ohio farmer father near Columbiana clearing $2,000 cash in the 1870s. Rare money for a farm back then. Education. Common school plus 3 months at business college. First job, a coal office bookkeeper. Then on the road with patent medicines. Busted. Carriage works in Columbus. Perfect for a horse trader with a farmer's eye. Hard rubber carriage tires were standardized in the late 90s. When his buggy firm died under a cut-rate rival, he pivoted. Tires as the main act. He consolidated a few shops, sold to the trust, took $45,000 cash, then met James A. Swinehart, who had a better way to fasten tire to rim. Summer of 1900, they formed Firestone Tire and Rubber. Hard years, until the car stopped being a toy. In 1905, Henry Ford said he'd build 2,000 cars at $500. Firestone took the tire order. He's been Ford's tire man mostly ever since. Same creed, workmanship, direct shots at bad patents. Ford killed Selden. Firestone helped break the G&J clincher hold. He's a benevolent despot in labor, does more than he must, doesn't want outsiders telling him how. Hard-boiled, impatient of restraint, but more individualist than Chisler. Men like him remade the country in 2 generations. The mistakes are bigger because the canvas is bigger. The payoff isn't just millions. It's work done, and the rare feeling you've pushed a little closer to the stars. The Astors matter as a clan. They're the heaviest landlords in New York. London's Duke of Westminster is the only clear rival on earth for prime city dirt. Their money today isn't stacked in 1 or 2 hands like the 1890s. Back then, the 2 grandsons of John Jacob Astor left estates around $170 million, net of lavish living, and forks for cousins by the handful. 6 generations on, the Astor bloodline runs to the hundreds, most touched, more or less, by the first man's investments. John Jacob I came to New York 2 years after the Revolution, with 5 guineas, 7 flutes, a hardback, and a gift for acquisition. But the family's American beachhead was his brother Heinrich, a butcher who trailed Sir William Howe's troops up Broadway in 1776, set up shop, bought cattle from skinners, and brought young John over to peddle sweets on the sidewalk. Heinrich died rich for the time, liked and respected. John had the extra gear, Fur and Tea, the American Fur Company, and a gift for timing, selling beaver when silk hat-making made pelts obsolete, dumping interests to partners who later broke. He also built the China trade. The land came almost as a reflex. Riding out where Times Square sprawls now, he'd meet a man buckling under a mortgage and buy acres cheap. He liked land the old country way, safer than stocks, as good as gold if you bought right and collected rents hard. That's how the Astors became landlords. He likely didn't foresee the city that would fill the Eden Farm, 41st to 47th, Broadway to 12th. If he had, he'd have held more downtown blocks. Often, he sold Wall Street land to raise cash for suburban farms. He died in 1848, $20 to $30 million, richest American, reputedly 5th in the world. Washington Irving liked him enough to take pay to write Astoria, the one public-spirited venture he backed aside from founding the New York Public Library at the prodding of Irving and Fitzgreen Halleck. The 5 Points masses hated his name. He left one son named for himself, an imbecile, and another, William Backhouse Astor, thwarted poet, turned landlord by a hard father. William squeezed rents from tenements where farms had been, died in 1875, and left $80 million to 2 sons. John Jacob III passed $90 million to William Waldorf in 1890. William died 2 years later, leaving $80 million to John Jacob IV, the Titanic victim. If the entire original pile had stayed intact, estimates say it would sit near $1 billion in capital today. It didn't. The family bought, held, and, contrary to legend, sold when areas declined. They weren't as rich as gossip had them. William Waldorf despised American life. He decamped to England, bought papers, fed the Conservatives, and bought himself a peerage. His children's reputations outran his. John Jacob IV, Vincent's father, had some social conscience, a dry style, and a touch of invention. He wrote an early science fantasy novel, anticipated turbines, put patents into the public domain, funded an artillery battery for the Spanish War, gave his yacht to the Navy, and then left a will fixed mostly on the family, virtually everything to a young second wife and her 2 living children plus 1 unborn, token gifts to a school, a club, a servant, a few friends. Nothing to charity. He died as handsomely as a man can, seeing his wife into a Titanic lifeboat, tipping his hat, walking off for a cigar with the other men. Vincent Astor was 20. He said he would work, and he did. Quit Harvard and sat at a desk at 23 West 23rd Street. He put in more detail than his father or his uncle, William Waldorf. He dropped the family's recycled names, John Jacob, William, even discourages his legal first name, William. He's the first Astor with a clear social conscience, good landlord by reputation, friendly to reform, openly pro-Roosevelt. He gives often and quietly. On assessments, his New York real estate costs about $43 million. But that's not all he owns. He sits on 10 boards: Great Northern, Illinois Central, Western Union, American Express, American Mercantile Marine, Chase, U.S. Trust among them. To the Senate Munitions Committee, he said, "My interests are almost entirely in New York real estate." When the tenement department asked him to help clean an East Side block where he owned 38 old law buildings, he said, "All right, gentlemen. Write your own ticket." He buys now mainly low-rent multifamily blocks in the Bronx, and he looks like a man not held hostage by his own net worth. He even founded Today, hiring Raymond Moley from the administration. A friend warned him what it would cost. "About $2 million, he said. "Ray's a good fellow. He just can't get along with those people in Washington. It seemed worth it to get him off Roosevelt's shoulders." He inherited about $59 million net, preserved it through collapsing rents and values, and has steadied the ship. He's married and childless. His younger half-brother, John IV, has an heir with the traditional name. They're not enemies, they're just not alike. When Vincent goes, does he hand the keys to a brother untested in stewardship, or split the estate, laying most of it on public service and leaving a comfortable slice for the blood? Judging by his record, the second ending feels truer. The Astors began with fur and tea and a peasant's nose for land. The modern one holds the title deeds and, for once in that family, seems to know the city isn't just a field to be harvested. They say 2 men rewired America's habits. Edison lit the room. Henry Ford put wheels under the chair. They were friends for life. When Edison's labs burned 20 years back, Ford showed up at dawn, slid him a signed check. "Fill it out for a couple of million," he said. "If you need more, let me know." That's the compass, not charity. He doesn't believe in it, but fuel for work that proves itself. He refused to bail the Guardian Detroit Union banks in February 1933, despite Hoover and Mellon asking. He and Edsel paid double liability and ate $45 million. He thought the banks weren't worth saving. Wrong system, wrong rules. Same spine that sent his peace ship out in a storm and tossed off the line. History? It's the bunk. Then spent years preserving it. Longfellow's Wayside Inn. Greenfield Village, a full working America of another age. The Edison Institute at Dearborn, the biggest mechanical museum anywhere. 2 years ago, they said he was finished. Chevrolet outsold him. Plymouth nipped his heels. In 1923, he sold 2,200,000 Fords, with 76,000 Chevrolets out there, and no Plymouth in sight. By 1932, he ran a $140 million deficit. But stack that against the ledger. Founded on $28,000 borrowed in 1902, grossed $783,642,000 up to then. Entered 1933 with $303,650,000 in cash, receivables, securities, and patents carried for pennies. In a grim lunch at the engineering labs, men moaned about Chevy and Plymouth. Ford let it run, then drawled, "Those fellows are out to get your minds off your work, and they seem to be successful." He doesn't worry about building a better car for the money. He assumes it. 72 and a boy, he walks 2 square miles of River Rouge, floats through 14 satellite plants within 50 miles, listens to school kids sing in a New England meeting house he moved to Greenfield Village, or gets his hands black on a part in the lab. Money is gasoline, not a throne. If you beat him fairly, he'll study your trick like a painter staring at a better canvas. "I'm making too much money on the darned things," he told pioneer builder Elmer Apperson once, and chopped the price. First cut, $650 to $550. He started as a speed car man, hired Barney Oldfield, rode in the car because ink was cheaper that way. The Speedster didn't pencil, so he turned the corner, mass market, low price, model built cheap, or not at all. The assembly line was the answer. One man, one action, the parts converging like weather. It bent the country's mind and broke old crafts. Maybe that's why he collects them now. Benches, tools, rooms where hands mattered. Competition woke his ad budget from its long nap. Agents' commissions bumped from 17% to 22%. Radio time bought. Copy sharpened. The V8 got prettier. On November 1st, 1934, he said, "So far as the Ford Motor Company is concerned, the Depression is over. Promised to build and sell 1 million cars in 1935 and spend at least $415 million doing it. By mid-May, he'd passed 500,000. On June 13th, the 23 millionth Ford slid off the line. What's he worth? In 1923, the Sunday Express called him the world's richest man. Rockefeller, Mellon, the Duke of Westminster, Zaharoff, Stinnes, Percy Rockefeller, Mitsui, Iwasaki, and the Gaekwar of Baroda behind him. In April 1923, after buying coal, timber, and water power, he admitted $200 million in cash. He moved from Model T to Model A without borrowing a dime. He bled red ink in 31 to 33, the way no other industrialist could stand and live. Yet on May 23rd, his report to Massachusetts showed 1934 surplus up $3,759,311 to $580 million. Robert H. Jackson told the Senate the company's net capital ran about $600 million. Others said $750 million. Profits for 1934, as of February 28th, ran near $119 million after taxes and depreciation. 1 year after they said the cheap car field had licked him. He changed rural life, made roads bloom, scattered production, through 14 towns around Detroit, and turned the country onto the machine. He pushed wage floors higher than anyone. On May 2nd, he put 125,000 men back to a $6 minimum, and he gets more work per man than anyone alive. Are they satisfied? Not all. His espionage runs tight. Organizers go quiet. He's a benevolent despot with a short fuse for musts. Edsel is more liberal, more tolerant, less dictatorial. But Henry likes to set the rules. No smoking, no liquor. Wages above scale when it suits him. Air conditioning and safety if it pays. When the economy sours, he'll cut heads to keep the hour and a quarter per car pace. Labor is labor to him, A tool he pays well when he needs it. Responsibility for misfortune is not his creed. Performance is. One of the last great individualists. Henry Ford, exactly. Most Americans don't know Earl D. Babst. They know his work. We eat more sugar per capita than anyone. This year's quota is 6,359,000 tons out of a world's 28,500,000. And Babst, since 1915 president of American Sugar Refining, prices the spoonful. His company melts 16 million pounds a day, about a third of what crosses the counters, and sits as the leading factor in domestic refining, with raw sugar muscle in Cuba, a 25% stake in National Sugar, and tight links to beet houses, Michigan and Spreckles. He isn't a sugar man by birth. He's a corporation lawyer with a salesman's nose for pennies on tonnage. Born 1870 in Chesline, Ohio. Pioneer banker for a father. Kenyon Prep, Kenyon College. Michigan law. In 1898, a train to Chicago changed him. Two rattled lawyers from newborn National Biscuit had a hearing the next day and a mess on their hands. Babst listened, soothed, solved. They hired him for the West, then in 1906 pulled him to New York as vice president and general counsel. He leaked out of the law into merchandising. New routes, new markets, growth. American Sugar had been the big trust under Havemeyer, 90% once. So corrupt on tariffs and so heavy on restraint of trade, it got broken up. It needed a head who saw the front of the counter. Babst canvassed 1,000 groceries himself and sent men to 3,000 more. How did people buy? Were they impatient while a clerk scooped? Loaf versus granulated? What about the new domino package? In since 1911. He already knew what happened when you pulled crackers out of a barrel and put them into bright boxes with a name. He banished the sugar barrel, pushed Domino and Franklin in multiple carton sizes, and hammered the brand. Advertising cost money, habit returned it. Teach the housewife to ask for your name, and you blunt surprise price cuts from a rival refinery. He turned American Sugar into the country's largest package retailer. But sugar's a treacherous crop. Cane thrives too much or not at all. Louisiana is capped near 200,000 tons. Texas lives and dies by weather. Cuba and Puerto Rico swing between bumpers and droughts, and hurricanes. Beet sugar is worse for labor. No machine has cracked the cultivation and harvest. It's ploughed, seeded, and hoed by hand. It yields rich per acre, but spends it on sweat. Easterners don't like beet sugar, and freight to the Atlantic punishes it. Most beet sugar gets eaten between the Mississippi and the Rockies. Worst of all, beets are political. Since the 1890s, the sugar beet has been a fetish of the high-tariff crowd. A farmer's salvation, a lobby's meal ticket. The Mormon Church, Heber J. Grant, Reed Smoot, stood behind the biggest beet house, Great Western, where American Sugar also held a block when Babst took the wheel. In 1933, beets covered about 1,036,000 acres and yielded roughly 1,300,000 tons the next year, supporting about 200,000 people on a claimed $350 million investment, farm to refinery to warehouse. Set that against 120 million Americans who need 5 to 6 million tons a year and then watch national price and tax policy bend around beets. First they were jealous of Cuba, then they feared the Philippines. People say Philippine independence and the terms of it were written with beet states in mind. Michigan, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, Montana, Idaho, California, plus a bench crowd. Around 1900, the Philippines grew 10,000 tons. Last year, almost 1,500,000, with capacity to double. General Wood guessed 5 million. Babst knew the arithmetic. It's cheaper to import cane from natural belts than to wall a nation behind a crop that exhausts soil. You can't grow beets on the same ground 2 years running. and lives on subsidies. He didn't say it out loud. The Pacific coast took Philippine and Hawaiian sugar. His work stayed with West Indian raw and the spread between buy and sell, while he fought a newer threat: planters refining on site with single-operation processes, exporting finished sugar and idling 5 immense U.S. refineries. Foreign refined imports climbed from 17,000 tons in 1925 to 600,000 in 1933. Babst helped organize the American Sugar Institute in 1927 to coordinate refiners and suppress wasteful, call it competitive, knife fights. Washington called it a combine. In 1927, the government said, American spread was 1.08 cents and profits $1,942,000. In 1928, spread 1.33 and profits $8,016,437. National Sugar's profits multiplied tenfold. The Institute denied the math, offered books, said spread was 0.90 in 1927 and 1.12 in 1928, and on July 22nd appealed to the Supreme Court to tell them whether they were legal. Meanwhile, Jones-Costigan was supposed to dam refined imports. They fell to 446,000 tons, off 24%, and beet deliveries rose 14%, likely from 1933 carryovers. On September 20th, refiners raised price 20 points to 5.30 cents a pound, 1/5 of a cent that makes a refinery rich at 6 million tons turnover. The company's books: 1933 net income $4,801,574 to $3.67 a common share. 1934 net $4,752,353, $3.56 a share. Wall Street expected 1935 to rise on that September advance. Babst draws $76,800, owns 1,000 common shares. His $90 million company puts that around $52,000 at market. The parent case: if tropical refined were barred, domestic volume climbs, unit costs drop. The idle 15,000 refinery specialists don't have to sail to the tropics or vanish into other machine shops. And the US stops, his words, subsidizing foreign refining while paying billions for unemployment. Whatever the philosophy, the figures tender his point. He is a quiet power. The American eats sugar by reflex. Quotas shift, spreads widen, prices step 20 points. And the country's coffee tastes the same. Until it doesn't. Sugar makes tariffs. It stirs and revolts. It starts wars. You don't have to love Earl D. Babst. You have to know he sets the measure in your spoon. He came out of the West with a minister's son's manners and a gambler's clock in his head. Floyd Bostwick Odlum, 43, glasses, quiet, watchful, built Atlas Corporation into the biggest investment trust in the country by buying value the way a butcher tests a roast. In Wall Street they call him 50%, Odlum. He likes a good company at 50 cents on the dollar. Born 1892 in Union City, Michigan, moved to Boulder, Colorado. He worked his way through the state university, ran the Dramatic Society, the paper, the yearbook, made money at all of it. Law school took 3 years. First job, Utah Power and Light's legal department in Salt Lake City, $50 a month. At $75, he married the daughter of a Mormon elder. She later ran Bonwit Teller for him. He learned utilities while Electric Bond and Share stitched together a continent's worth of small companies. He knew the Rocky Mountain systems, cold, got sent east to Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett, the Combine's law firm. He hit New York in June 1916, left his wife and baby in Grand Central, and walked downtown in a sombrero, wondering why everyone stared. Sidney Z. Mitchell, assembling Bond and Share, spotted the steal in him and poached him from the firm, personal legal advisor to vice president. Odlum stayed until 1929, buying foreign utilities from Chile to Romania, spending hundreds of millions under contracts tight enough to hold water, brick and air. But he meant to be his own boss. After the 1921 dip, he and another young lawyer from Simpson Thacher, a Dartmouth man, George H. Howard, formed a private pool. $10,000 each for themselves and their wives, folded into the United States Company, 1923. A 100% stock dividend that first year. By 1924, they were printing money. They brought in Odlum's brother-in-law, L. Boyd Hatch, to work the market. Friends pounded on the door. By 1929, they had 40 stockholders, $800,000 invested, and $6 million in assets. The clock told him to sell. Summer 1929. He liquidated more than half the portfolio at the top. Cash only. He reorganized as Atlas Securities, added 450 stockholders, and $9,900,000 more capital. Again, cash or short notes. When the street cracked a couple of months later, Atlas was sitting on roughly $12 million liquid. That cash would become a winch. The big idea: investment trusts were new, hard to pledge as collateral, and selling at fire sale prices even when the underlying holdings had real worth. Let Atlas absorb them, stock for stock, and their owners might recover value later. It worked. Atlas began swallowing contemporaries that lacked liquidity. He kept turning the pile, sell when the profit was safe, buy when the price sagged. First half of this year, he sold 925,000 common shares and rolled the proceeds into better angles. He ate the General Corporation, June 1930. Ungerleider Financial, $9 million book, April 1930. Sterling Securities, $25 million, July. Chatham Phoenix Allied Corporation, 21 million bank subsidiary, August. National Securities Investment, $10 million. In 6 months of 1930, he doubled Atlas's assets, cash and governments included. Then came the trophy. Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation. Atlas started with 500,000 of its 5 million shares from Ralph Jonas, kept picking up blocks until Odlum had about 40%. He rechristened the giant Pacific Eastern, changed Atlas Securities to Atlas Corporation, no longer utilities only, moved into 30 Pine Street, and started sorting the loot. Sub-holdings like Shenandoah and Blue Ridge were proving out. First half increases came in roughly plus $2,500,000 and plus $1,200,000. He kept moving. April last year, 50,000 shares of Fox, Chase was selling. Rumour said the English Fleming Trust wanted in, and the British Treasury didn't like the capital flight. July, an RFC block controlling public utilities securities, salvaged from Harley L. Clark's wreckage. An attractive investment, Odlum said. October 11th. With Lehman Brothers, he bought Radio's control of Radio Keith Orpheum and took an option on the rest. They'd already worked on Paramount Publics. Before that, Atlas had bought into Fox, Warner and Lowe's. People whispered about a motion picture combine. It wasn't that. Representative Sabbath saw a coming fight with the House of Morgan for control of industry. That didn't wash either. Howard, Odlum's old partner, runs United Corporation, a Morgan utility empire. Odlum deals with everyone and belongs to no one. He has seats near Bond and Cher. He's done big jobs with Lehman. He's moved with T.A. Fortington, the quiet agent of the Liverpool Insurance Group. If there's a faction he hasn't traded with, name it. He says he rebuilds what's worth saving, pays dividends off restored value, and takes his cut clean. Last August, Atlas reported assets of $110 million and $36 million in capital surplus, built on a base he once turned from $800,000 to $6 million, and then to a liquid war chest before the crash. He doesn't speechify. He isn't a wrecker. He buys right, moves fast, and leaves working companies behind. Keep that pace 12 more years, and the country will say Atlas, where it used to say Morgan. W. Averill Harriman grew up in the long, cold shadow of a legend. His father, Edward Henry Harriman, E.H. to Wall Street, was a human thunderbolt. Small, wiry, and relentless, E.H. turned the Union Pacific from a streak of rust into the most efficient transcontinental railroad in America. He went to war against giants like James J. Hill over the Northern Pacific and Burlington railroads, backed by Kuhn, Loeb, and the Rockefellers, while Hill had Morgan in his corner. Their battle triggered the Northern Pacific corner of 1901, when shares rocketed to $1,000 each. E.H. walked away with $60 million and control of Northern securities, until Theodore Roosevelt's big stick, swung by Attorney General Philander Knox, smashed the trust apart. E.H. kept swinging. When the courts forced him to break up his hold on Southern Pacific, he simply found new appetites to feed. He was a man of his time, a robber baron with a code. If he bought it honestly, it was his, whether it was a house or a railroad. By the time he died, he was worth $100 million, all of it left to his wife in a 100-word will. Charity didn't make the cut. He trusted her to know what to do. Most of it passed to their two sons, Roland, the sportsman, and Averill, the heir apparent. Averill was 18 when his father died. Dark, lean, and serious, he was fresh out of Groton and heading to Yale. He had a gift for driving an 8-oared shell across water in a 5 minutes flat, but he was too light to make the varsity crew. So he pivoted, accepted the verdict without complaint, and became chief coach in his senior year, an honor only one undergraduate before him had held. He kept up his grades, kept the dorm lights burning late, and graduated in 1913 near the top of his class. Skull and Bones tapped him, marking him as one of the men most likely to succeed. But success wasn't guaranteed. He started life with a handicap most men never face. He was the son of E.H. Harriman. Wall Street watched to see if the boy could wear the crown. He joined Union Pacific the way his father would have wanted, through the ranks. He worked in roundhouses, shoveled coal into locomotive fireboxes, and learned the trade from the ground up. Within a year, he was vice president in charge of purchases and a director representing the family's dominant interest. But something gnawed at him. He didn't want to just follow his father's tracks. He wanted the horizon. He and his father had talked about it often. America couldn't stay a closed continental power. Trade was the future. Wherever British, German, French, or Italian ships went, American ships had to follow. The First World War gave Averill his opening. "I felt certain that shipping facilities would prove the neck of the bottle," he said later. He went to General George Goethals with a plan to build steel ships in quantity. Goethals agreed. Harriman bought a yard in Chester, Pennsylvania, and built another, the Harriman Yard. From 19 ways he launched 48,800-ton cargo carriers and a fleet of minesweepers. It wasn't enough. It only sharpened his appetite. In 1918, he bought into two small coal-hauling lines, the Independent and the Shawmut, through a parent company called the American Ship and Commerce Corporation. 2 years later, at 29, he swung for the fences. Through that holding company, he formed United American Lines and bought control of Kerr Navigation, with 10 ships totaling 77,620 tons, and the American Hawaiian Line, which with its subsidiary owned another 271,487 tons. He leased another 143,465 tons from the U.S. Shipping Board. Overnight, he commanded a fleet of 51 modern ships, 468,902 deadweight tons. America had never seen a private shipping venture like it, He wasn't afraid to think globally. Harriman negotiated with the Hamburg American Line to swap office space, terminals, and shipping routes. The Germans brought experience and pre-war connections. He brought ambition. When critics like Kermit Roosevelt, once a Kerr vice president, called him reckless for dealing with the Hun, Harriman didn't blink. He kept moving. He knew what he was up against. American shipping couldn't stand alone without public support, government backing, and Wall Street's money. He said so often, and he meant it. Some of his father's instincts lived on in him. In 1922, when the United Mine Workers needed money to fund a strike, Harriman lent them $100,000 on nothing more than the signatures of William Greene, John L. Lewis, and Philip Murray. He told them they could have $5 million if they needed it. It was a bold move. His father would have admired the guts, if not the social conscience behind it. His overseas ventures weren't as lucky. In 1926, teaming up with Anaconda Copper, Harriman took control of the Geisha Syndicate in Upper Silesia, a $20 million operation producing coal, zinc, and other metals. He secured a manganese concession to mine 2.75 million tons, paying a $3 per ton royalty over 5 years. That same year, he tried to finance $35 million in German trade with the Soviet Union. But the U.S. State Department refused to recognize the deal, refused even to recognize Russia. His Silesian interests got him a seat on a Polish bank's board. When the Soviet plan collapsed in 1928, he bought the Bismarck, Hütte, and Katowice iron works from the Polish government. His ideas were audacious, sometimes reckless, always global. His ships circled the 7 seas. He was a player in Austrian banking. He launched a plan to electrify all of Western Poland. On the polo field, he hit a 7-goal handicap, world class. No other young American millionaire was thinking so far beyond the borders. Then the party ended. The boom years crashed into the Depression. Harriman took his medicine like a man. No one knows how much he lost. Some say he still cleared $5 million from Germany and another $5 million from Russia. Maybe. What's certain is that Poland paid him only $100,000 to cancel the electrification project. He sold his shipping lines, and if he broke even, he counted himself lucky. The dream of empire at sea was over. He was back on the rails. Defeat didn't sour him. He believed he'd been beaten by forces bigger than any one man. America, he argued, had more growing up to do before it could think like a global power. He preached it often, not bitterly, but as a man trying to solve the problem of excess production choking the economy. He opposed destroying surplus goods. He preferred the British model: guarantee domestic producers a profit, then dump the surplus abroad for whatever it would fetch. And he hated the idea of selling junk overseas for inflated prices. Let produced wealth be fairly distributed, he said, and don't attempt the impossible by redistributing bricks and mortar from unproductive facilities. Our future lies in producing more and distributing more. In March 1934, President Roosevelt appointed him Special Assistant Administrator of the NRA. That November, he became Acting Director of Public Relations. Wall Street reporters had nicknamed him High Hat Harriman for his aloofness. But in Washington, he swung the doors wide open. He even took to the stump, overcoming his distaste for public speaking to sell Roosevelt's policies and his own vision for America. His speeches were notable for what they lacked: no bunk, no cheap applause lines, just clarity and thought, rare qualities in a man of great wealth. Through it all, the rails remained his obsession. Steamships had been a detour, railroads were destiny. As chairman of Union Pacific, he pushed the company into the future, championing the streamlined trains that shattered transcontinental records. He believed railroads didn't need government aid, only a revived economy and smarter, leaner operations. There were other ventures too. In 1930, he merged his own W.A. Harriman and Company with Brown Brothers, creating Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, one of the most powerful investment banks on Wall Street. In 1934, its securities business split off as Brown, Harriman and Company. By then, Harriman was 44, vigorous, athletic, and seasoned by hard lessons. Unlike his frail, dyspeptic father, who didn't become a major player until later in life, Averill had been a force since his 20s. A few years earlier, he'd been called the fourth richest man on Wall Street. He'd made and lost millions, and still had plenty left. The Harrimans held roughly a quarter of Union Pacific's stock. Their other interests were vast. Averill Harriman had tried to chart his own course, through shipyards, mines, and foreign banks. But the rails kept calling him back. He was shaped by a titan, tested by global ambitions, tempered by failure, and driven by a restless vision. And if the past was any measure, his future was going to be worth watching. Andrew William Mellon kept his fortune in the shadows until he didn't. Then he took the treasury, and the table tilted his way. Richest man in America, or second or third, doesn't matter. He influenced more lives than any American of his era, short of Edison, Rockefeller Sr., and Ford. The Mellon banks, 6 of them, centered on Union Trust of Pittsburgh, sit on something like $500 million in resources. The web of Mellon banks and companies runs between $8.5 and $10.5 billion in assets. The family's cut, Andrew, his son Paul, his daughter Ailsa, and her husband David Bruce, nephews William Larimer Mellon and Richard King Mellon, son-in-law Alan Magee Scaife, lands around $2 to $2.5 billion. The methods? Efficient if you judge by pile height, dubious if you judge by anything else. Stock watering, squeezing rivals, paper that says more than the assets under it. Yet nobody built faster, cleaner, on the ledger, for one family. He had the edge no other modern magnate did. Harding made him Secretary of the Treasury in 1921. Coolidge kept him. Mellon had conjured a reputation for financial magic. Hoover kept him until Congress's rumble sent him to London. They called him the greatest Treasury chief since Hamilton. While he sat in cabinet, 8,599 banks failed. In the 16 years before, split between parties, 4,873 failed. His company's assets were estimated at $1.5 billion in 1920, $2.3 billion by 1921, 1929. 4 Mellon firms jumped from $105 million assets to $432 million. Gross profits for Mellon companies in 1929 were put at $230 million. Dividends in 1930 were counted in tens of millions. He approved tax refunds to himself and his companies of $75 million or more, $100,000 to Mellon personally, $10 million to Aluminum Company of America, his tightest monopoly. Refunds during his tenure topped $1.3 billion. When Senators Cousins and Nye pressed an investigation and retained Francis J. Heaney, Mellon rushed to Coolidge, demanded Heaney's scalp. Coolidge obliged partway. The facts still crawled out. In 1929 alone, Mellon companies were awarded $2,500,000 in refunds, $210 million in amortization allowances out of $235 million were ruled illegal. Accountants kept finding the note, "This is a Mellon company." He lost his temper when Cousins, who had sold his Ford stock to Ford for $40 million, ripped into the leniency shown to Republican rainmaker William Boyce Thompson. The Treasury promptly sued Cousins for $11 million in back taxes, 3 years after the file opened, 1 week before the statute ran. Cousins beat them. He said, "Give me control of the Internal Revenue Bureau, and I will run the whole damned country." The masterpiece while in office was the Barco oil field in Colombia, rich, near tidewater, cheap to pump. Mellon bought the concession from Henry L. Doherty's Cities Group for $1,500,000 in January 1930, after Columbian nationalists cancelled it. Commerce put out circular number 305 warning New York against Columbian bonds. Mellon waited. Bogota needed dollars, a political turn came, and in June 1931 the new government granted his interests a 50-year concession on the Barco fields. June 30th, National City Bank floated a $20 million loan to Columbia. If Texas dries up, Gulf, the Mellon oil flagship, has lifeblood from Bar Company. It may be richer than aluminum or Union Trust before it's done. His government posture was class straight. In 1923, Harry Sinclair gave $300,000 in Liberty bonds to the Republican National Committee. Will Hayes parceled the bonds out to big men to keep the ledger clean. Mellon's share was $50,000. He turned in cash, returned the bonds, and said nothing until Senator Walsh dragged it out years later. Asked if he knew the bonds might be part of bribes that had touched Albert Fall, he said, "That might have been my impression, but it was none of my business." Asked earlier, he'd simply not been asked about any bonds. Before Treasury, he'd kept his name off the page. The New York Times didn't print it until January 1921. He wasn't in the 1914 list of the 100 richest families. Harding hadn't heard of him until Doherty slid the name across the desk. The family story is iron tight. Grandfather out of Ulster with a few guineas and a pack of notions. Father Thomas, a judge, turned moneylender, cold and exact. He taught his boys to love paper that pays mortgages, notes. Andrew learned a wider game from Henry C. Frick, the coke and steel boss. They pinched Carnegie, traded jibes with Morgan, but kept Frick in the light and Mellon in the dark. After Judge Mellon left the bench, 1870, he formed Thomas Mellon and Sons. Andrew, slender, shy, blue-eyed, drove it. In 1889, two inventors offered an electrolytic route to aluminum smelting. He bankrolled it, Aluminum Company of America. Today, it controls roughly 90% of U.S. aluminum. Profits jumped from $1,864,000, 1933, to $5,446,000, 1934, and the trend points up. Government has sued 3 times in 7 years. Appeal courts twice ordered retrials. Also, in 1889, he formed Union Trust with $250,000 capital to manage estates. It grew into Pittsburgh's pivot bank. It swallowed Mellon National and others. It pays the country's richest bank dividends. He studied where his money went. He lent millions to railroad equipment trusts, then founded Standard Steel Car, later merged into Pullman. He organized Union Steel to annoy U.S. Steel, then sold at a profit. He founded Crucible because the market wanted it. He ran pipelines to hold up Standard Oil. He bought Gulf Oil off the Spindletop legend from Colonel J.M. Guffey and pyramided it into the family's most promising engine. Barco makes it deeper. He consolidated rail and river coal fields into Pittsburgh Coal, 1901. In 1906, he bought into Westinghouse Electric and Westinghouse Air Brake. By 1930, he held roughly 20% in both. The list of companies where he held 5% to 100% ran to assets, around $10 billion. The family share to roughly $2,500 million in 1933, likely more today. He is 80 now. He looks like a tired double-entry bookkeeper, worried about his job, and he's probably the single most powerful economic individual on earth. If you're hunting for conscience, you find little. His creed is family first, balance sheet second, the world far behind. The one, Mellon, who talks otherwise, Paul, he has tried to bend back to form. If you want the psychological key, read Judge Thomas Mellon's private autobiography, Marriage as Contract. Daughters who die young need not be greatly lamented. That's the house Andrew W. Mellon built and lived in, cold, precise, and large enough to shade a nation. He runs the Banker's Bank from Trinity's shadow and prefers customers who arrive with 6 figures already in their briefcases. George F. Baker, young Mr. George, well into his 50s, followed a father so flinty he kept roll-top desks and backless stools into the 1920s, and still produced the most consistently profitable bank in New York. The First National Bank of New York began as the city's first national charter. It sat at 2 Wall. It stayed there. It lent to the government in war, to states and rails and municipalities in peace, handled oceans of U.S. bonds, and cultivated correspondence among out-of-town banks. Its creed: conservative credits, few losers, dividends like clockwork. No retail clutter. The Bakers frowned at accounts under $200,000. Yet inside, the place felt like a family parlor run by austere uncles. Fair salaries, generous bonuses, quiet help for sickness and age, kindness delivered as personal checks from old Mr. George, not the bank. When inspectors finally declared the old pile unsound, the son built a resolutely modern tower, his boldest break from the mutton chop era. Even so, the institution kept its old power. Before the crash, First National stock crossed $8,000 a share. In 1929, it earned $20,700,000, $206 a share. Through 1933, it still threw off $10.8 million. By 1935, it had $12 million in net earned profit and nearly $100 million in surplus reserves. It trades peerless. Chase and National City, don't touch it. Is the son the power or the president? On paper, Baker is chairman as his father was. But since 1922, Jackson E. Reynolds, Columbia law, self-possessed, feared and respected, has run the day. Wall Street still guesses at which hand is heavier. Meanwhile, Baker sits on the great grid of American power. At T&T, Consolidated Gas, GE, GM, Mutual Life, New York Central, Pullman, U.S. Steel, U.S. Trust, plus the New York Yacht Club Commodore ship he actually enjoys. His board bristles: Myron Taylor, U.S. Steel, Harold Vanderbilt, presidents named Reynolds and Gifford, and so on. He swims through surf to make dinner, enlisted as a private at 40 after resigning a safe Red Cross commission, married into the Brevorts, and still glows when a grey clerk toasts him at the annual party. He looks serious behind nose glasses, someone who wants to be a good guy and fears betraying the iron face that raised him. On taxes, he moves like a strategist. Timed gifts of $4.6 million in stock to shave $156,000 as a new year dawned. On policy, he says little. The Sphinx frowns, the bank earns, and the family of 200 employees keeps calling him Mr. George. The father made a verb of Standard Oil. The son turned the verb into endowments, real estate, and a different kind of power. John D. Rockefeller, senior 96 and spectral, is now a legend who sometimes emerges to press a bright dime into a palm. His era, pipelines seized, tank cars controlled, rivals throttled by distribution chokeholds, is gone. Standard Oil, the trust, died by Supreme Court decree a quarter-century ago. Its 33 heirs compete with Gulf, Texas, Shell, Sinclair, and a legion of wildcatters, and with one another. Standard's share of U.S. oil is nearer 40% than the old 80 to 90%. Control shifted to John Jr. He learned at 26 Broadway, then learned again at Ludlow. The strike and its massacre forced him out of the bunker. Ivy Lee, a cool new kind of advisor, told him, "Earn a case the public can accept, then explain it." He did. From that moment, the son set the family's pitch. He's been moving out of oil and into the map of Manhattan. Rockefeller Center rose in a depression. More blocks along 5th and 6th went quietly into family hands. 6th Avenue's L is coming down. 2 more 11-story houses are planned on 54th to 55th Streets. Real estate men whisper the Rockefellers may already hold the single most valuable concentrated tract in the city. The oil unwind is measurable. As of November 30th, 1934, Junior still held 5.56 million Saucony vacuum shares, 2.74 million Standard of New Jersey, 1.87 million Standard of California, about $258 million then, more than 10% in each. Within months, he distributed giant blocks, ultimately gifting some $77.6 million in oil stock in 1935 alone, mostly to charities, dropping his visible stake to approximately $180 million. He sued the Treasury over charitable caps and negotiated the bill down, but the larger arithmetic is plain. The family has given away sums no dynasty in history has matched, $750 million by 1928, likely another $250 million since, through the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the Rockefeller Institute, and scores of specific grants. The method of the father still matters. He rarely cheated investors, never peddled paper that couldn't be covered by the assets, and built monopoly by owning distribution, pipes, cars, ships. The method of the son is different. Hire first-rate managers, a Teagle at Standard of New Jersey, a Gifford at AT&T, sit on boards when necessary, step off when wise, and channel wealth to projects that outlive the quarterly. He reversed himself on prohibition, with candor the elder never showed. He wrote the Baptists that his future gifts would be inter- or non-denominational, aimed at lowering barriers. He shed directorships, keeps only a few, banks, Rockefeller Center, and lets hired men run the oil. So why include him among those who run the country? Because even divesting, he can still move markets and remake cities. Because a single letter from his office can reconfigure a block, a hospital, a university. Because the portfolio, oil reduced but not gone, banks and that granite river of Midtown stone, is still vast, impeccably tended and aimed. Had they not poured out the billion, they might be worth 2 or 4. As is, they remain one of America's great houses, transmuting crude into culture, pipelines into plazas, and the most controversial name in business into a long, deliberate afterlife of public works. Atterbury called him unquestionably the ablest railroad executive in the country, then handed him the throttle. Martin W. Clement, 53, is no empire builder. He's the consummate hired master of a machine, the Pennsylvania Railroad, whose size and polish often dwarf the man at the top. The Pensie's 26,000 miles lace 13 industrial states, a compact, self-contained grid with English-level track, excellent equipment, proud morale, and one of the nation's best safety records. Shareholders have drawn dividends since 1847, over $1 billion in all, even if the Depression trimmed the coupon. Clement inherits a road that suffered but adapted. Fares and freight ticked up in 34 to 35. Dividends crept back. September earnings rose 30% year on year. Federal lifelines helped, $80.6 million in PWA loans to electrify New York-Washington and buy 101 motors. Electrification promises long-run savings, though diesels and streamliners elsewhere may prove thriftier, an uncomfortable what-if. The real burrs lie off the main line. As an operating company, the PRR is one thing. As a system, entangled with Penn Road, the holding arm, it bears the Long Island's burdens and, via layered stakes, effective control over New Haven and Boston and Maine, New England's lifelines that don't love being steered from Broad Street Station. New Haven bleeds red. Governors mutter about trustees or forced divestitures. Clement will have to choose defend sunk capital and distant control, or cut loose and focus on the quadrilateral the Pensy truly owns. New York, Washington, St. Louis, Chicago. Clement's pedigree is military, 3 generations of generals. His training purely railroad, Rodman to vice president. His manner blunt and clubby. Detective yarns, garden puttering, fishing. He's anti-statist to the bone. Railroads should be run as the Pensy is, autocratically but justly authority grading from the top, not by professors and agitators. And yet he is emblematic of the age, a $60,000 a year expert serving a board, not a commodore owning a road. The Pensy made him, and owns him, while he keeps the long red trains on time. You hear of Van Sweringens. You rarely hear of Arthur Curtis James. Yet he owns more railroad stock, miles for miles, than Hill, Harriman and Gould ever held at once, and did it without strutting. Heir to Phelps Dodge Copper, Amherst 89, averse to limelight, generous in private, prohibition, pro-labor, he set himself a hill-sized dream. Unify the northern transcontinentals and make the Northwest hum. The Interstate Commerce Commission won't let him call it a system, but in fact, he stitched one together. By the late boom, he controlled heavy blocks in Great Northern and Northern Pacific, Hill's pair, plus the Burlington they jointly owned. In 1926, he quietly seized Western Pacific, with Missouri Pacific and D&RG, that gave him Chicago-Denver, Burlington, Denver-Salt Lake, D&RG, and Salt Lake-Sacramento-Oakland, Western Pacific. The Moffat Tunnel cut 170 miles. Mechanical refrigeration opened the produce trade. And, in 1931, at Bieber, California, he symbolically drove the gold spike linking Great Northern South to Western Pacific. A parallel northern prong ran Chicago Twin Cities Seattle via Burlington, plus Great Northern/Northern Pacific. In sum, nearly 40,000 miles influenced, about 1/7 of U.S. trackage, knit by a single quiet shareholder. But it's empire, in fact, not in law. The ICC's map partitions the West into systems, 14, 15, 16. Consolidation must wait on Washington and on time. James is 68, childless. His holdings, often routed through A.C. James and Company and the twin Curtis Southwestern entities, may dissolve with succession, as American fortunes usually do. Until then, he is capitalism at its tidiest, colossal personal capital bent to upbuilding the territory served, not to headlines. He told the West exactly that, and meant it. He keeps a Park Avenue house and a Newport place, but he's best known to the public by white canvas and wind. His square-rigged auxiliary bark, Aloha, not a sleek diesel toy, has twice circled the globe under his licensed eye. He once drove her New York-Gibraltar in 16 days. Tall, spare, and still sea-strong, he has built the last great transcontinental network, quietly. When prosperity returns, his paper should fatten by the hundreds of millions. After him, the usual American ending, dispersion, not dynasty. But while he lives, the invisible hand on the throttle from Chicago to the Bay belongs to Arthur C. James. A Boston Brahmin with a ducal air, Frederick H. Prince was one of the richest and most elusive American capitalists. By 1929 he was pegged around $250 million, and he's widely said to have sidestepped the 1929 crash by selling at the top. At 77, he still ping-ponged between New York, Chicago, London, Paris, his Pride's Crossing estate, and Pau at the foot of the Pyrenees, where he masterfully ran the storied Pau hunt with 86 foxhounds and 62 hunters. He bought the America's Cup contender Wheatamo at 72, once thumped a rough polo opponent with a mallet, and paid $15,000 for the privilege, and thinks nothing should be done anyway but his way. Ask the War Department, which turned down his exact site for a $500,000 memorial chapel to his Lafayette Escadrille son, Norman. Officially head of Frederick Prince and Company, he boasts of having owned 46 railroads, often running heavy debt as a tool, not a fear. A genuine system thinker, he pitched the White House in 1933 on the Prince Plan: consolidate all Class Thumb lines into 8 regional systems, 2, each for East, South, Northwest, Southwest, jointly owned terminal lines, and absorb viable smaller roads. He projected approximately $743 million in annual savings, mainly from operating labor cuts, with a 2-year half-pay cushion for displaced workers. Labour balked, proposing British-style lifetime employment protections. The ICC distrusted Prince from earlier cases, Père Marquette, and the plan stalled. Still, much of his regional logic likely foreshadows what everlasting US rail settlement emerges. Never idle, he pivoted to meatpacking. By late 1933, he had quietly built about 5% of Armour's Common, enough to control a 4 million share base held by 40,000 investors, restructured the board, took the executive committee chair, and reworked stock to his advantage before sailing for France. Since he's mostly tended his vast portfolio and his sport, adding Marble House in Newport, bought from the Vanderbilts, to his stage. Prince is capitalism undiluted, frank, combative, and convinced. Speculation is essential, he says. Progress rides on risk-takers. Professors? One of the chief curses, talkers living off endowments made by doers. He wants seasoned European-style statesmen running policy. Favors a 6-year single presidential term with automatic Senate birth. Is cool on the Constitution as a modern tool. And sees New Deal methods shading toward fascism, something he doesn't inherently fear, so long as wealth's prerogatives stand. He admires Roosevelt's boldness, expects him to admit failures and pivot, and believes radical ideas need adult supervision. Above all, he's the plain-spoken grand seigneur of rugged individualism. A man who used the system to live exactly as he pleased, and who thinks others' lesser fortunes are on them, not on capitalism. The age that produced him is fading. His certainty never did.